What if an ancient city was built so precisely that its streets, temples, and towers aligned with the geometry of the earth itself, not by accident, but by design? Stay with this, because what follows isn't just about ruins in the sand. It's about a level of knowledge that shouldn't have existed in that age. Keep watching closely, because the deeper you go, the more the ground beneath this story begins to feel deliberate. The city does not announce itself from a distance. There are no towering walls rising above the horizon, no obvious skyline to signal that human intention once shaped this place. From afar, it blends into the landscape so seamlessly that travelers often pass near it without realizing what lies beneath their feet. Only when the sun is low do subtle lines appear in the terrain, faint ridges and angles that catch the light in ways natural formations rarely do. These lines trace patterns too straight, too consistent, too mathematically clean to be the work of wind and erosion alone. When the first careful surveys were conducted, something strange emerged. The main avenues of the city were aligned not merely to cardinal directions, but to precise angular offsets that matched significant latitudinal and longitudinal markers. The central plaza formed a perfect square when mapped, its sides oriented to subtle deviations from true north that corresponded to the curvature of the earth at that specific latitude. This is not trivial geometry. To achieve such alignment across a sprawling urban plan requires an understanding of the planet's shape and scale that most modern people assume ancient societies did not possess. The city's builders did not place structures randomly or for simple aesthetic symmetry. Temples, administrative buildings, and ceremonial platforms were positioned along lines that, when extended across the landscape, intersected at points that mirrored natural features far beyond the city's boundaries. Rivers miles away, mountain peaks on the horizon, and even distant valleys appeared to fall along these geometric paths. It was as if the city had been mapped onto the earth rather than merely built upon it. The city did not impose itself on the land. It mirrored the land's deeper structure. At first, researchers thought this alignment might be coincidence. Humans are excellent at finding patterns where none exist. But as more measurements were taken, coincidence became statistically unlikely. The alignment repeated across different sectors of the city. The angles were consistent. The proportions echoed geometric ratios found in natural systems, ratios that appear in spiral galaxies, plant growth patterns, and wave formations. This was not decorative symmetry. It was structural geometry. What kind of knowledge does it take to design a city like this? Not just practical surveying skills, but conceptual understanding of the Earth as a curved surface, of angles that remain consistent over distance, of spatial relationships that extend beyond the immediate horizon. This implies either advanced observation over generations or access to a tradition of measurement that preserved global-scale knowledge. Neither fits neatly into the simplistic view of ancient societies as locally focused and technologically limited. The city's orientation also appears to have been calibrated to astronomical events. Certain avenues align with sunrise on specific days of the year. Others frame the setting of particular stars during seasonal transitions. This suggests that the geometry was not purely terrestrial. It was cosmological. The city was designed as a bridge between earth and sky, between human movement and celestial rhythm. Walking through it would have meant moving through a living calendar, where architecture and time intersected. Yet the city was not built to dominate its environment. Its materials were sourced locally. Its scale was human. The geometry does not overwhelm the landscape. It harmonizes with it. This is what makes the site unsettling. Modern cities often impose grids for efficiency or control. This ancient city seems to have been laid out as if in conversation with the planet itself, as if the builders were less concerned with conquering space and more concerned with aligning themselves within it. There are hints that the geometry served more than symbolic purposes. Water channels follow the same alignments as ceremonial roads. Drainage systems curve in ways that reduce erosion and guide runoff along stable paths. The city's layout appears to optimize not just ritual movement, but environmental flow. This is design that integrates physics, ecology, and symbolism into a single plan. It is not architecture as shelter. It is architecture as understanding. The most provocative question is not how they built it, but why. Why invest so much effort into aligning a city with planetary geometry? One interpretation is that the builders believed harmony with the Earth's structure brought stability, that aligning human systems with natural patterns reduced the friction between society and environment. If true, this reflects a worldview radically different from modern assumptions of dominance over nature. It suggests a civilization that saw itself as a participant in a larger system rather than a controller of it. But there's another possibility. The geometry may have served as a form of knowledge storage. By encoding measurements into urban design, the builders created a physical map of Earth-based understanding that could be walked, lived in, and passed down without written records. Even if texts were lost, the city itself preserved ratios, alignments, and relationships. Knowledge embedded in stone and space is harder to erase than knowledge written on fragile surfaces. Over time, the city was abandoned. The reasons are unclear. Environmental shifts may have made the region less hospitable. Political changes may have drawn populations elsewhere. What remains are the bones of design philosophy that outlived its creators. The geometry did not decay with the people who made it. It waits, quietly, for those who notice the patterns. If you're still with this, don't look away yet. The deeper layers of this city reveal that its geometry may not have been isolated. It may have been part of a much larger network of aligned sites across vast distances. What if the city wasn't designed as a single marvel, but as one point in a vast geometric pattern spread across the Earth itself? Stay with this, because the moment you zoom out, the city stops looking isolated and starts looking intentional. Keep watching closely, because a pattern only becomes visible when you stop looking at one place at a time. When researchers began extending the city's primary alignments beyond its boundaries, they noticed something unsettling. The geometric lines traced through its streets did not fade into randomness as they crossed a landscape. They continued, intersecting with distant landmarks as if the city had been pinned to a much larger grid. Hills that appeared naturally placed fell precisely along these extended lines. River bends matched angular relationships found within the city itself. Even the placement of smaller satellite settlements mirrored the same proportional spacing. This raised a controversial idea. The city might have been positioned deliberately within a regional framework of aligned sites. If true, this implies coordination across distances that would have required not just local surveying, but shared standards of measurement and orientation across generations. It suggests that the builders were not simply constructing a city. They were placing a node within a system. As more sites in the region were studied, faint echoes of the same geometric logic appeared. Not every settlement fit perfectly, but enough did to suggest intention rather than chance. Some ruins lay along the same angular corridors defined by the main city's avenues. Others matched the spacing ratios between key structures. The pattern was not rigid like a modern grid. It was organic, adjusting to terrain while preserving proportional relationships. This is important. It indicates the builders were not forcing geometry onto the land. They were mapping geometry through the land. How would such coordination have been possible without modern tools? One explanation is that the builders used long-term observational methods. Over generations, they may have tracked celestial movements, shadow angles, and horizon markers to calibrate large-scale orientation. Knowledge would have been cumulative, passed through specialized roles within the society. This kind of slow science does not leave obvious artifacts like machines. It leaves patterns in landscapes. Another possibility is that they possess portable reference systems, standardized rods, cords, or sighting devices that allow consistency across distance. These tools would not appear advanced to modern eyes, but their effectiveness lies in disciplined use, not complexity. Precision does not always require technology. It requires method. The idea that ancient societies could coordinate construction across regions challenges a modern bias. We often assume large-scale planning requires centralized authority and rapid communication. But coordination can also emerge from shared cosmology and tradition. If communities believe that aligning with certain geometric and celestial principles ensured harmony or prosperity, they would replicate those principles wherever they settled. Over time, this creates a network of aligned places without any single controlling center. This reframes a city not as a lone anomaly, but as part of a cultural language written into space. The geometry becomes a shared script, repeated across landscapes. Each city or ceremonial site becomes a sentence in a larger text describing how humans saw their relationship with the earth. This is a different kind of civilization building. Not one focus on dominance or expansion, but on resonance, placing human life within patterns believed to be meaningful on a planetary scale. There are hints that the geometry encoded more than aesthetics. Certain alignments appear to track environmental thresholds. Lines pass through regions of stable water flow, avoiding zones prone to erosion or landslides. The spacing between settlements corresponds to resource distribution patterns, suggesting that the geometry helped balance population density with ecological limits. If so, the system functioned as a form of environmental management disguised as sacred design. Over time, as cultures shifted and populations moved, the logic behind these alignments faded. New settlers built atop old foundations without understanding why certain angles were chosen. The geometry persisted physically but lost its explanatory story. This is how sophisticated systems degrade. The structure remains, but the rationale disappears. What was once functional design becomes interpreted as ritual symbolism or coincidence. When modern researchers rediscover these patterns, they face skepticism. Large-scale alignment theories are controversial because humans are prone to pattern seeking. Yet the accumulating evidence challenges dismissal. The consistency across independent sites, the correlation with environmental features, and the mathematical coherence of the alignments all point to intentional design. The question is no longer whether the geometry exists, but how such knowledge was maintained and transmitted without leaving explicit records. The city built in perfect geometric alignment with the oath might be one surviving node of a forgotten spatial language, a language that once linked communities through shared orientation rather than shared borders. A language that treated the planet not as empty space to be filled, but as a patterned surface to be read and respected. What if the greatest loss wasn't the city itself, but the knowledge of why it was built that way? Stay with this, because when meaning fades, structure becomes fragile. Keep watching, because this is where precision turns into ritual and systems begin to break. As generations passed, the people who lived in and around the geometrically aligned city continued to maintain its streets, temples, and water channels, but the original reasoning behind their layout slowly thinned. The geometry remained physically intact, but its function became abstract. Alignments once used to manage environmental flow and celestial timing were reinterpreted as sacred tradition. Ritual replaced measurement. Ceremony replaced calibration. This is not failure. It is cultural drift. When knowledge is transmitted without its underlying logic, it transforms into belief. The city's architecture became increasingly symbolic. New structures copied the angles of older ones without understanding why those angles mattered. Builders preserved proportions out of respect for tradition, not because they grasped their systemic role. Over time, small deviations accumulated. A road was shifted slightly for convenience. A channel was redirected to accommodate new construction. Each change seemed harmless in isolation. Together, they began to distort the original geometric coherence. This distortion had consequences. Water systems that once followed optimal paths began to erode soil where angles were altered. Drainage patterns that had harmonized with the terrain became less efficient. The city's environmental resilience weakened subtly. Because the system failed gradually, no one recognized the loss of underlying design intelligence. The city still functioned. It simply functioned less smoothly. The astronomical alignment suffered similar drift. Festivals once timed to precise solar and stellar positions became fixed to calendar dates rather than observed celestial events. The living relationship between architecture and sky hardened into schedule. This decoupling reduced the city's ability to adapt to long-term shifts in seasonal patterns. What had once been a dynamic calibration system became a static ritual framework. The geometry, stripped of its explanatory layer, became vulnerable to reinterpretation by power structures. Rulers began to use the city's sacred alignments to legitimize authority. Positioning oneself at certain nodes of the geometric network was framed as divinely sanctioned. This politicization of geometry altered priorities. Preservation of symbolic centers took precedence over maintenance of functional systems. Resources flowed toward monumental structures rather than infrastructure that supported everyday life. As environmental conditions shifted over centuries, the city's original design could have adapted. The geometry was flexible enough to accommodate change if recalibrated. But recalibration requires understanding. Without it, responses to change became reactive rather than systemic. Flooding in one district led to ad hoc barriers instead of rebalancing drainage across the network. Heat stress in dense neighborhoods prompted localized shading rather than broader spatial adjustments. The city's coherence weakened. There are traces in the ruins of attempted reforms. Some sections show evidence of redesigns that tried to restore earlier alignments. These efforts appear fragmented, suggesting that knowledge of the original system survived only in pieces. Partial understanding can be dangerous. Restoring one alignment without adjusting related systems can create new imbalances. The city's layout became a patchwork of intentions layered over fading logic. At a certain point, the geometry that once optimized flow began to constrain it. Streets aligned for wind management became heat traps as climate patterns shifted. Water channels calibrated to historical rainfall struggled with altered precipitation cycles. The very precision that once made the city resilient now made it brittle when its adaptive logic was lost. Precision without understanding is rigidity. This rigidity likely contributed to the city's abandonment. As living conditions became harder to manage, populations gradually relocated to more flexible settlements. The city was not destroyed. It was outgrown by a world that had changed while its design philosophy had frozen. The geometry remained beautiful, impressive, and increasingly impractical. The tragedy is not that the city was abandoned. It is that the system of thinking that created it did not survive in a usable form. The builders embedded knowledge into space. Their descendants inherited the space, but not the code to read it. When environments change, civilizations that rely on rigid interpretations of inherited design struggle to adapt. If this resonates, it's because the pattern repeats. Societies preserve structures long after forgetting why they were built that way. Infrastructure becomes tradition. Tradition becomes dogma. Dogma resists change. Systems that once harmonized with the world become misaligned with it. What if the moment the city began to fail was the moment it was preserved too perfectly? Stay with this, because sometimes what we refuse to change becomes what breaks us. Keep watching, because this is where harmony turns into rigidity. As pressures mounted, leaders and caretakers of the geometrically aligned city faced a dilemma they did not fully recognize. The city's layout had become sacred. Its angles were no longer seen as functional design choices, but as inviolable symbols of cosmic order. Altering them felt like sacrilege. This reverence froze the city in a form that had once been adaptive but now resisted necessary change. Environmental shifts made certain districts increasingly difficult to inhabit. Heat accumulated in narrow corridors that had once been cooled by predictable wind patterns. Water channels overflowed during rare but intense rains, eroding foundations that had been designed for steadier cycles. Instead of recalibrating the underlying geometry to account for new conditions, leaders commissioned surface-level fixes. Walls were raised. Canopies were added. Temporary barriers were erected. These interventions treated symptoms while leaving the rigid framework intact. The city's population began to fragment. Those with means relocated to peripheral settlements where layouts were less constrained by sacred geometry. These newer settlements were messier, less elegant, but more adaptable. Streets bent around new water sources. Buildings shifted orientation to capture changing winds. Life became easier at the edges and at the center of the grand design. This created a quiet inversion. The perfectly aligned city, once the heart of stability, became the most fragile part of the region. Cultural pressure kept the city alive longer than it was practical to do so. Rituals, festivals, and governance remained anchored to its geometric centers. Abandoning these spaces felt like abandoning identity. This emotional attachment delayed necessary adaptation. When societies invest meaning in structures, they often conflate preservation with survival. But preserving form is not the same as preserving function. The city's infrastructure decayed in ways that masked deeper failure. Patches and reinforcements gave the impression of resilience. But resilience that depends on constant emergency maintenance is not resilience. It is exhaustion. Over time, maintaining the rigid geometry demanded more labor than the surrounding communities could provide. The cost of keeping the city aligned with its past design philosophy outpaced its practical benefits. At some point, a critical service failed. The exact trigger is lost to time. It may have been a water system collapse, a structural failure during an extreme weather event, or a breakdown in food distribution caused by the city's inflexible layout. Whatever the cause, it exposed how brittle the system had become. The response was not a dramatic evacuation. It was a gradual withdrawal. Families left first, then artisans, then administrators. The city hollowed out from within. What remained were caretakers and priests, preserving rituals in increasingly empty spaces. The geometry was still perfect. The plazas still aligned with horizon markers. The temples still framed celestial events. But the city had become a shell of its original purpose. It was no longer a living system calibrated to the earth. It was a monument to a way of thinking that no longer fit the world it inhabited. Abandonment was not defeat. It was adaptation at a different scale. People moved toward systems that could change with conditions rather than resist them. The aligned city did not fall because its builders were wrong. It fell because their descendants treated their design as timeless rather than situational. The geometry was meant to be a living dialogue with the planet. It became a fixed scripture. This is a quiet ending of many great designs. They succeed so well in one context that future generations mistake their form for universal truth. When conditions shift, reverence for form prevents recalibration. Systems that once harmonized with their environment become misaligned with new realities. Stay with this to the end, because the final part reveals what the city still teaches us today, and why rediscovering the logic behind ancient precision might be more important than preserving the precision itself. What if the true secret of the perfectly aligned city isn't how precise it was, but how willing its creators were to change that precision when the world changed? Stay with this, because the final lesson of this place isn't carved in stone. It's hidden in what was allowed to fade. Keep watching, because this is where the story stops being ancient and starts being about us. Long after the city was abandoned, its geometry remained intact enough for later visitors to sense that something deliberate lay beneath the ruins. Travelers noticed the strange calm of the streets, the way sight lines still framed distant peaks, the way the sun still slipped through certain corridors at precise moments of the year. Without knowing the system behind it, people felt the harmony. This emotional resonance is powerful. It makes precision feel sacred even when its function is forgotten. Modern researchers who mapped the site uncovered the deeper logic. The city was not a rigid blueprint imposed on the Earth, but a snapshot of a living relationship between people and planet. The original design allowed for recalibration. Alignments could be adjusted. Proportions could shift. The geometry was a method, not a monument. The tragedy was not that the city was precise. It was that later generations froze that precision into dogma. When design becomes doctrine, adaptation becomes heresy. The city's decline shows how systems fail not because they are wrong, but because they are treated as eternally right. The builders understood that harmony with the earth requires continuous observation and adjustment. Their descendants preserved the form but lost the practice. This is the difference between wisdom and tradition. Wisdom evolves. Tradition repeats. There is a quiet irony in how the city is studied today. Researchers marvel at its alignment with the earth, its astronomical precision, its integration with landscape. These qualities are framed as lost genius. But the genius was not the alignment itself. It was the mindset that produced it, a mindset that saw design as dialogue, not domination. The city was a conversation with the planet, not a command. The ruins still offer more than aesthetic wonder. They reveal how embedding knowledge into space can preserve patterns longer than text can preserve instructions. But they also reveal the limits of that approach. Without a living culture of recalibration, even the most elegant systems become brittle. Knowledge needs renewal, not just preservation. The perfectly aligned city stands as a reminder that precision is not the goal. Relationship is. Aligning with the earth is not about freezing geometry in time. It is about staying in tune with changing conditions. When civilizations forget this, their greatest achievements become their constraints. If this story shifted how you see ancient cities, don't let it stop here. Follow for more hidden patterns and lost civilizations. Share this with someone who loves deep history. And remember that the most advanced knowledge isn't what builds the most perfect structures. It's what teaches us when to change them.